Welcome back to Monster Tamer, a 2D Pokemon-like RPG created with Phaser 3. Previously, we took a look at how we can start building out our level in Tiled, and we're going to go ahead and continue working on our level in this video. If you missed the previous videos, there'll be links in the video description to the source code up to this point, as well as complete source code for this video. There'll also be a link to previous videos if you'd like to catch up. So let's get started. Alright, so now we cover some of the basics of how we can actually create a level background using Tiled. What we're going to do next is we're going to look at how we can add in a custom layer for checking for collisions. When you import your data into a phaser, there are a few different ways you can go about this. When you import in your custom level, you could have phaser go ahead and be in charge of taking all of this data and then using those sprite sheets to go ahead and draw out each of our individual sprites to create our level. And then what we could do is we could use these individual layers to also create our collision layers in Phaser. And then that way we can check for collisions between our game objects and these individual sprites that were created. Another way you can go about this is if we want to limit the number of assets we need to load in Phaser, we can actually export out our current level as an image. And then what we can do is we can just load this full image into Phaser, and so we're only loading in the one asset, and this whole image would be drawn as a sprite as our background. The downside of doing it this way is we would still need to go through for each of our layers and define like what would actually be collisions. And so what I like to do in my games is I actually like to create a specific layer that's just for collisions. And then that way I can associate a different sprite with it. And then it's like very clear to me what the collision layer is for our game. So to see an example, what we're going to do is I'm just going to make another tile layer. And I'm going to call this collision. And for my collision, I don't want to use one of our existing sprites. Instead, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I want to import in one of our other assets, and I'm going to use this collision PNG. So this is just going to be a very basic red square, and it's going to make it very evident that this space is used for checking for collisions. And so the one I'm going to do is with this sprite, I'm going to go ahead and start drawing onto our layer. And so I'm just going to use the shift key to go ahead and draw for like our whole tree line. And then that way we'll know like we don't want to allow our player to go into our trees. And then what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to modify some of the opacity. And so what this will allow us to do is it's going to show our layers that are beneath our current layer. And then that way for our collision layer, we can kind of see what's actually drawn to our map. And it makes it really easy to work while we're working inside tiled here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and paint over all of the areas where the player shouldn't be able to walk. So down here, we don't want the player to actually be able to walk through our fence or our water. Same thing here, we don't want the player to be able to walk through that water. And then also, we don't want the player to go ahead and go through our tree and then also our building. And then finally, let's go ahead and do our fence post. And now we have our collision layer. And so what we can do now in Phaser is if we set up our game this way, when we import this particular layer, we can associate this particular tile asset with it, and we can actually draw these sprites onto our image, and then we'll know what our collision layer is in Phaser to make it very easy to debug while we're working with our data. And so one thing to know is if we want to create some depth for our game where our player could move behind our game objects, and that way we actually have some depth, we wouldn't actually want the top of our tree and the top of our building to actually be part of this collision layer. Instead, we'd want to render the tree over our player game object, and then that way it looks like our player's walking behind it. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we're just going to erase these top pieces here, and then that way in our game, we'll have our player come up and move behind those assets. And so while we're on the topic of that, when we export our game, as I mentioned, we'll be doing a single image. And so in order to create that illusion of depth and to have the proper rendering, we're actually going to need two images. We're going to need an image for the basic background, and then we're going to need an image for these pieces where the player can walk behind them. And so for our building, what we're going to go ahead and do real quick is we're going to make another layer. And what we're going to go ahead and do is for this layer, we're going to go ahead and call this foreground. And on this layer, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and paint onto this layer the appropriate pieces that be involved in that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and turn off our treetop. And what we'll do is we will go ahead and paint that onto our foreground. And then likewise for our building, what we'll go ahead and do, because we didn't break it up, we will come over to our building. Let's just go ahead and grab these sprites here, go ahead and paint those. And now if we toggle off our building, we should see that we have the top of our building on our foreground. And then what that'll allow us to do is later, when you export your images, you can export just the visible pieces, and then you can have that be its own image. All right, so now that we have our collision layer, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at adding an encounter layer. So one of the things we didn't draw on our current level is we didn't add any grass. And so one of the typical things of your Pokemon games is you'd have grass areas where you can walk through them and you have a chance to encounter a wild monster. Likewise, this could be if you're in the water, it could be if you are in a cave, and so we're going to want to add an encounter layer where we have the chance to encounter our wild monsters. And so to do that, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to make a new tile layer, and we're just going to call this grass. And so for this tile, what we're going to go ahead and do is we are going to go ahead and go to our bushy grass, and we're just going to go ahead and paint this area onto this tile here. And then we're going to go ahead and lock that. And then kind of like what we did for our foreground layer, we're going to make a specific layer for our encounters. And so we're going to call this encounter. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another color. So we're going to browse for our encounter PNG. We'll go ahead and import that in. And then we're going to go ahead and use that to go ahead and paint onto this particular layer. So we're just going to go ahead. Oh, we need to actually select the right color. So we select our yellow. All right, if we go ahead and modify our opacity, we'll just have a similar look to like what we did for our collision layer. All right, so next we're going to work on adding some custom objects to our level. So we'll be adding in custom objects for both our NPCs and for our interactive game objects, so our signpost. So what we'll do real quick is let's make a new tile layer, and we're going to call this signs. And what we'll do is we're just going to go ahead and add a sign to our level. And then we need to go ahead and update our collision layer to also include our sign. So let's go ahead and unlock that. We'll go ahead and go into our collision, and we'll draw that. And then what we'll do is to go ahead and create our objects. What we want to do is make a new layer. And so this is going to be an object layer, and we'll call this signs. And so one thing to note is for your objects, they're going to have a different icon, so you can easily identify the difference between that and your tile layers. All right, so for our object layer, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and paint sprites onto our level. And so to do that, we'll want to go ahead and select this tool here for adding a sprite to our existing object layer. And so then when we do this, it's going to place a new object onto our layer. And so if we hide our initial signs tile layer and we reveal our signs object layer, we'll see we have this object. And so with our objects, what we can do is we can add custom properties to them. And then that way in our phaser editor, we can grab those properties and do something with them. So a good example for our signpost is we can add a message that would be displayed to the player when they interact with it. For our NPCs, this could be their dialogue or even their walking path for when they move around. And so to add custom properties, we just come over here to our editor, we hit the plus icon, and then we get our default property types that are built into tiled. So like strings, objects, booleans, and then what you can do is you name that property. And so for example, I'm just going to call this message. And then here, you'll be able to go ahead and add any value that you like for those custom properties. And you can add as many as you like. So maybe if I want to add a Boolean, I can name it that. And then we can have a checkbox if it's true or false. And so this is really great if you only have a couple objects. But if you have a lot of objects where you want to use the same properties on them, what you can do is you can define a custom class and then assign your object to that class. And then what will happen is any properties on that class will be inherited on this object. And so to go ahead and do that, what we're going to go ahead and do is we'll come up to our menu, we'll go to View, and we're going to go to Custom Types Editor. All right, so then in our custom type editor, what we can do, we can define our own custom types that we like to use in our project, and we can define our own custom classes and add properties to those classes to use them as a base. So as an example, we can create like an enum. So this is where we can add our own values. So this is where we can create an enum to restrict our values that we want to use. For our class, what we can do is we can add a class, and then we can add properties to that class, so we get the same members, and so we get the same types that we had before, and we can give them a name. So as an example, for like our sign, if I call this message, we can add that string, and then we can have a default value if we'd like. And so what we're going to do for our game is we're going to go ahead and go import. And so inside the asset folder that we downloaded, there's this custom types JSON file. And if we go ahead and import that, what that's going to do is it's going to add 4 new custom types that we're using for our game. And so we're going to go ahead and have one for our NPC. So this is going to have properties tied to our NPC, like the frame that we're going to show for this NPC, messages that the NPC might say to the player, and then their movement pattern. And so for our movement pattern, that is referencing a custom enum that we've added for type of movement the character will do, so clockwise and idle. So we're going to use this for determining how the NPC will move about our game, if they do move or not. And then we have a custom class that has no properties, and this is just used for identifying the path our NPC is going to walk. And then we have our sign class, which will just have our message property. We'll have the message we display on our sign. And then what we can do is when we create our objects, what we can do is we can assign a class to those objects. And so now we have our custom classes here. So if I choose sign, what will happen is it doesn't look like anything changed. And that's because we already have a custom property of the same name. So if we remove our property that we added, message, and then we remove our additional Boolean, we'll see here that we can't actually remove message. And instead our class is saying, hey, we have this message property and we don't have a default value assigned to it. And so if we wanted to add an additional sign as an example, so if we go ahead and grab our sign, and we choose this, let's add another object. And if we do our class, what we should see is when we add sign, message gets added automatically. Likewise, if we choose like our NPC or one of our NPC paths, our properties update to reflect the properties that are tied to that class. All right, and so one of the useful tools here is this is your object selection tool. So this is how you can select your objects and move them, and then that way you can actually delete them. All right, and then so for our sign, let's go ahead and add a custom message. We're just going to say welcome, and then what will happen is when we export out our JSON file, all this custom metadata will be in there. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and work on adding in our NPCs. So for our NPCs, what we're going to do is we're going to add a new group layer, and we're going to call this NPCs. And so basically a group layer is just a way for you to group your layers together and a way to organize them. So basically it'll just be a nested structure. So like if I want to add a new object layer to our NPCs here, what we can do is we're just going to call this NPC1, and we can place this inside our folder, and now we have all of our NPCs grouped together. All right, so for our NPC, what we'll do is we're also going to use our yellow image for adding our NPC to our scene. So what we're going to do is on NPC1, we're just going to add an NPC right here on our map. And we're going to go ahead and update our class to be NPC, and we're just going to add a name of NPC to our property. So you'll see here on our map, it shows the name of that object. So this makes it very easy to identify your various objects that you add. All right, and then so for our NPC, and so frame, this is going to be the frame of the character sprite sheet that we want to use. So real quick, back in our assets, originally we added in this character's PNG file. So this is a sprite sheet of our retro RPG characters. And so the frame we specify, so like 0, this NPC will have this frame here selected. And so then we're going to use that data to know which frame to pick for our NPC. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to do 0. And now we can add in any messages. So when the player talks to the NPC, these will be the messages shown. So we're going to do, hey there. And then what we can do is if we want to show multiple messages, we can go ahead and add in some type of separator to go ahead and break up our messages. So as an example, if I do 2 colons, we'll use that as our separator for knowing you have another sentence. So then that way when the player talks to this NPC, it'll say, hi there. They hit the space key and we can show another message. And we say, the weather is nice today. And so now this NPC is going to have 2 messages, and we'll use that for breaking up this string into an array in our code. And then finally, for our movement pattern, this is how we want our character move around our scene. So for idle, these NPCs won't actually move around, but clockwise, we're going to expect some type of movement pattern to have our NPC move around. So we'll have this NPC here just be idle. And so what we're going to do is let's go ahead and lock our NPC 1 layer, and let's add another layer, and we'll add another NPC. So if we go ahead and add in another object layer, we're going to call this NPC 2. And then what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and we'll do this NPC up here. And so what we'll do is let's go ahead and update our class, and we're going to do NPC, and we're going to call this NPC so we can identify it. And then what we'll do is we're going to do frame 20 for this NPC. And then what we'll do is we are going to go and just say hi for the message. We'll only have one, and we're going to have this NPC move in a clockwise pattern. And so for our code, for our clockwise pattern, what we're going to expect is we're going to expect some type of path drawn onto our map, and then our character will move through that pattern. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to make a very simple path. So we're going to add a new object here. And we're going to call this for our class NPC path. And we're just going to say number 1. And then this will be the first step in our path for our NPC to take. Then what we'll do is we'll do the same thing here. And so we'll do our NPC path. We're going to call this 2. And then we're going to have one here. This will be 3. NPC path. And then what we're doing is basically we're designing a simple path that our NPC is going to follow as it moves around our scene. And we'll go ahead and do 5. And so what we're doing here is we're just designing a very simple path. And in our code, what we're going to do with our NPCs is we're going to check for the next value in the path and then have our NPC move in a clockwise pattern. So this does require custom code, but it's a very simple way for us to define very simplistic NPC movements using our map data versus having to implement like an AI. All right, so now that we covered the basics of how we can go ahead and build our actual level, what we're going to do is we're going to show how we can actually export out this data and then import it into our Phaser game. So the first thing we want to do is we want to export everything out as a JSON file. Then that way we have all of our level data in the JSON format, and we can import that in to create our metadata for like our NPCs, our interactive objects, our encounter area, our encounter, and our collision layers. So to do that, we want to go ahead and go up to File. We're going to do Export. And then what we want to do is in our export, we want to go ahead and choose the JSON map file for our export type. And then for our name, we're going to call this level JSON. And so if we go ahead and export that out, what we'll do is we'll get a JSON file that's going to look similar to our initial level JSON that we loaded before. And so this will have all of our level metadata, and we can use that in our game. The second thing we want to do when we export our data is we need to go ahead and export out 2 images. The first one's going to be our initial background. So this is going to have our whole world scene exported, and then we're going to render that as one image in our game. And so to do that, what we're going to do is let's turn off our all of our object layers. Then we want to go ahead and turn off our encounter and our collision layers. And then that way we just have a very nice, simple, basic image. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do export as image. And what we want to do is we want to go ahead and specify the name of our image, and we're going to call this background. And then what we want to do is we want to only show our visible layers, so we want to make sure this is checked. All of the other settings we can leave not checked. And so what this will do, Tile will go ahead and export that as our image. So in our project folder, we should see our background PNG, and we have our nice level background here. For our second image, this is what we'll want to export out our foreground. And so this is what's going to give us the illusion of depth in our game. And so for our foreground, basically we just want to go ahead and hide all of our layers except for our foreground layer. So if we hide all of those, we're just going to have a very basic image here that's transparent with our foreground objects. And then what we'll do is similarly, we'll do export as image. And for this one, we're going to call this foreground. Likewise, we only want to show our visible layers, and we'll go ahead and do export. All right, so then what I'm going to do is we're just going to go ahead and turn back on all of our layers. And what we should now be able to do is go ahead and import in this data into Phaser and go ahead and use them. All right, and so now with our export out data, we can go ahead and import those into our game. So what we'll want to do is for our levels JSON file, we'll want to place that in our assets data folder, and we'll replace our level.json. And then for our images, we actually need to name those as level background and level foreground. So if we place those two images in our Monster Tamer map folder, we'll go ahead and replace those there. And once you do that, our game should update and all we should see is a black background. And so this makes sense because our current demo image is a lot smaller than our existing level that we had before. And so what we're going to do is we'll come into our data manager and we're going to go ahead and update the starting position for our player to be 1-1. And then now what we should see is when our scene now loads, we should see our demo level that we created. And what we should be able to do is move around our scene, and we'll see that our foreground's working properly, where we can move behind our objects. And our collision layer is working, and we're not able to move into our red zones. And then finally, if we go into our encounter area, what we should see is we've encountered a wild monster, and it goes into our battle scene. And so real quick, we'll come back and just do some more testing. And so now if we move around, we should move around a little bit without there always being an encounter. All right, so as we continue to work on our world scene, we're going to go ahead and use our original level JSON file and original level images in our video series. So you are welcome to go ahead and use your level that you create in Tiled if you like to create your own. But for the remainder of the video series, we're going to just assume we're using that original level. So if you want to use your own level, just a few key things to point out, so then that way all the logic will continue to work with the code we're going to write, is when you create your NPCs, you'll want to make sure you have the NPC class for your object for our NPC. If you want the NPC to be able to move around, you'll need to have the NPC path class, and you'll just need to place them in the order that you want them to be in. And then for your sign objects, you'll want to make sure you have the sign class with the message property so we know what messages we want to show. And then for your collision layers, we'll just want to make sure we have a layer with it clearly defined where the player cannot move through. And likewise for the encounter layers, we'll just want that defined as well. And you just need to make sure you have the same naming conventions here, so then that way we import that data, everything will work appropriately. And then finally, just one thing to remember is when you finish editing your level, if you want to make changes, you just need to export it out as an image for your background, and you want your foreground to be on a separate image. And then that way, when we place it in our scene, we can place it on top of our player game objects and our NPCs. All right, with that actually brings this video to an end. In our next video, we're going to go ahead and continue working on our world scene, and we're going to focus on adding in our interactive game objects, so then that way our player can interact with our signs. So just as a reminder, there will be links in the video to the source code up to this point in the series. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see the links on your screen now.